Most civilizations decline because they are not strong enough. But the three most brilliant eras in Chinese history were each destroyed by their own strength. Across 2,000 years, China reached the top of the world at least 3 times, and each ascent looked like an entirely different version of civilization. One that opened the world with swords, one that drew the world in with culture, and one that rewired how the world worked with technology. Each created heights that no contemporary civilization could match. Each fell in a completely different way, but stack the three stories on top of one another, and an almost cruel common pattern emerges. What killed them was exactly what made them great. The first peak was a peak of force. In 138 BC, a Han Dynasty envoy set out from Chang'an with over 100 men, walking west into a world no one in China had ever seen. His name was Zhang Qian. This was not a successful mission. He was captured by Xiongnu cavalry almost immediately after entering the Hexi corridor and held prisoner for 10 years. When he finally escaped, he did not turn back. He kept walking west across deserts and mountain ranges. When he reached the territory of the Yuezhi, the people he had been sent to recruit as allies against the Xiongnu, he found not a vengeful nation eager for war, but a settled people with no interest in revenge. Diplomatically, the mission was a complete failure. But Zhang Qian stayed in Central Asia for over a year. He saw the famed blood-sweating horses, tasted grape wine, encountered entirely different nations and societies, a vast world that the Central Plains had never imagined. 13 years after his departure, he returned to Chang'an with only a handful of survivors. Over 100 had set out. A handful came back, but what he brought was worth more than an army, a map, and a possibility. The western regions were not wasteland. They could be drawn into the empire's system. Emperor Wu of Han saw that possibility and spent decades of war turning it into reality. He drove back the Xiongnu, seized the Hexi corridor, and pushed the empire's borders deep into Central Asia. The route that opened up was later given a more romantic name, the Silk Road. Goods, technologies, religions, and ideas began to flow along it, and China was woven into a transcontinental network for the first time. At the other end of Eurasia, the Roman Empire was reaching its own zenith at almost the same moment. The two empires never saw each other directly, yet through silk and rumor, they formed a distant symmetry, two poles of the known world. This was China's first era as a global power. But the system carried a hidden cost. It required constant reinvestment. Frontiers had to be garrisoned, wars had to be fought, trade corridors had to be maintained. The more successful the empire became, the more expensive it was to sustain that success. When the treasury began to buckle under the weight of expansion, the cracks were already forming. The Han Dynasty's problem was not that it was too weak. It was that it was too good at expanding. The second peak worked in an entirely different way. On a morning in the 8th century, the western market of Chang'an had just opened for the day. A Persian merchant exchanged freshly minted Kaiyuan Tongbao coins for a batch of porcelain. Nearby, a Japanese monk bent over a desk copying Buddhist scriptures. From a street corner came the drumbeat of a Sogdian whirling dance, and the crowd watching it haggled in half a dozen languages at once. This was not the frontier. This was the heart of the empire. Tang Dynasty, Chang'an, was quite possibly the most cosmopolitan city on Earth. Different civilizations did not merely trade here, they lived here. Religion, art, language, and aesthetics mixed and fermented in the same space. This time, China's power did not radiate outward from its borders. It pulled the world inward toward its center. Culture became a force of attraction. Institutions became a template. Neighboring states studied, imitated, and even embedded themselves within the system voluntarily. But it was precisely this openness that blurred the empire's boundaries. Frontier military commands grew powerful, regional governors accumulated more and more resources, the balance between center and periphery began to tilt. When the Anlushan rebellion erupted, what tore the empire apart was not a foreign enemy, it was a force that had grown up inside the imperial system itself, one that simultaneously controlled frontier military power and Central Plains administrative resources. Openness was the Tang Dynasty's greatest charm. It was also the blade that eventually turned inward. The third peak looked the least like an empire. The answer is hidden inside a painting. In the scroll known as Along the River during the Qingming festival, a river cuts through a city. The water is packed with merchant vessels, the bridge above is crowded, people arguing, people rushing. Inside a tea house, a merchant is settling a bill with paper money. The entire city is in motion, trading, calculating. This is the Song Dynasty. Shift the lens from warfare to economics, and a startling picture appears. The Song's economic density, commercial sophistication, and technological level were quite possibly centuries ahead of the rest of the world. Printing made knowledge replicable. Gunpowder began reshaping the nature of war. The compass freed navigation from the coastline. Paper currency broke transactions free from the physical limits of metal. This was a new kind of power, not conquering the world, but rewriting the rules the world ran on. But this system depended on a precondition: stability. Commerce required order, cities required security, technology required long-term accumulation. When militarized states emerged to the north, the Song did not abandon war entirely, but it increasingly relied on money to substitute for military outcomes. Every year, massive shipments of silver and silk went north to the Liao dynasty to purchase peace. The logic was essentially the same one the Han Dynasty had used with its marriage alliances centuries earlier: spend money to buy time. But unlike the Han, the Song did not convert that time into lasting military strength. Instead, the time was reinvested into more commerce and more economic growth. This created an accelerating cycle. The more prosperous the society became, the less willing it was to fight. The less it fought, the more it depended on paying for peace. The weaker its military capacity grew, the more it had to pay next time. From the Liao to the Jurchen Jin to the Mongol Empire, the pressure closed in step by step. The Song Dynasty's problem was not that it lacked sophistication. It was that it depended too heavily on the very order its sophistication required. Stack these three histories together, and an almost ironic structure appears. The Han collapsed because it was too good at expansion and could not bear the cost. The Tang was torn apart because its openness produced forces it could no longer contain. The Song grew so prosperous that it lost the capacity to defend its own prosperity. Three entirely different paths to greatness, leading to three entirely different modes of failure. But perhaps the most remarkable thing is not why they fell. It is why they were able to rise again, each time in a completely different direction. A single civilization reaching the top of the world 3 times on 3 separate tracks, that fact alone may be harder to explain than any individual peak. The ways of failing were never the same, yet the ability to start over never disappeared. Whether this is the resilience of a civilization or simply the same cycle wearing different faces may depend on whether the story still has another chapter to come.